kind of want to talk about endings a little bit more today. We're getting pretty close to the ending here. You can see where we're at. About this much more to go. A fraction of what we've done so far. And what kind of sparked me to think about the way to end things is this passage here, where it says, "The Marco Polo spoke, 'Your chessboard, sire, is inlaid with two woods, ebony and maple. The square on which your enlightened gaze is fixed was cut from the ring of a trunk that grew in a year of drought. You see how its fibers are arranged. The quantity of things that could be read in a little piece of smooth and empty wood overwhelmed Kublai. Polo was already talking about ebony forests, about rafts laden with logs that come down the rivers, of docks, of women at the windows." And first off, I kind of wanted to project sort of an open-ended idea into this portrayal of either the metaphoric or place-holding representation of things, right? I think that even things which seem to be just a game in our reality translates to some form of value in regards to our emotional well-being. I think that it's trivial, but still, quantifiable to an extent. The idea that even things which aren't necessarily played for something physical and are, in a sense, just played for fun, sort of takes its toll. I think that you could say, the more you play anything, the more you risk. And if I was to try to branch this out into a more complete thought, which had a satisfactory ending to it, kind of going back to that ending kind of phase, I would relate the idea to this idea where maybe you realize how valuable you are to the world. If you have nothing more to lose, then it reveals truly who you are. And in that point in time, I think that maybe you can realize and recognize this idea of your inseparable nature with reality. Maybe at that point, winning and losing can almost become equitable in regards to our being able to say that playing is winning, in that we are willing to accept the risk of playing. And the idea that we are indispensable sort of at that moment can be on both sides of the equation, where it equals somebody who has nothing to lose and somebody who has everything to lose. After all, you only have yourself to lose. And sort of where I want to take this thought in regards to this book, is what is an ending? And what is a better kind of ending? Is it an ending with more or an ending of less? Which one satisfies our heart's desires? And is there any sort of true ending to all of this? Or lesser endings which make us feel like life is just not giving up? It doesn't matter how many times we try, the moment we get it was made up of something that almost had no chance but it's in those moments that we can recognize experience. And we can say that maybe it's only like this for one thing. For anything with little experience isn't going to be able to judge any sort of chance-like experience anyways. So maybe then we can relate that point to us again right there in that way. And I kind of wanted to talk about that way in which, you know, he points to sort of this ending of things. And it's almost like being able to pick up on a trail, you know, as to whether or not saying that there's more to something is going to be a good hunt. And in essence, provide you with a good end. So, going off of their conversation style, which is very eccentric and filled with wordplay and metaphors and wild hairs, I think that in this context, it's fairly acceptable to sort of change the topic. And I think that ultimately your ability to change the topic is your ability to give a good ending, in the sense of saying that there's more, if we're talking about the types of endings that we can give. And what I mean by that is he uses something as sort of a point to make the conversation traverse the space, which would be the border between our abilities to maintain a line of reasoning that doesn't cost us much to keep going. I think that the greater our change of direction is within regards to conversation, the more that it costs if we try to retain the entire conversation and the gaps between two polar opposites of an aspect that we're trying to adhere to. Because ultimately, I think that you have to sacrifice something. I think that you have to sacrifice maybe the game and be willing to play another game. And I think that once you start looking at life like a game, then when you start having these types of endings, which are very sort of erratic, and you allow there to be more chance involved, with there to be a connection between 2 points of immeasurable distances, then you either have to have one of two things: be the most experienced, or be something which is fairly inexperienced. And then maybe it means nothing the more that those two things sort of can meet. And then so in that place where something would cost a great deal for somebody to try to connect things with, perhaps things with experience or things with no experience, being in between the two, where is true chance? Where is true luck? Maybe that is sort of the waters in which everybody tries to bridge over all things with, is this idea of there being true chance. And perhaps we can understand that maybe that's why our hearts tend to lead towards there being, at points in time, no such grand design to all things. Because the more that we have this idea, the more that we can have to gain from there being something of chance and luck, if it is something that we experience. And all of these things sort of go up against each other, especially when you try to create these types of endings yourself, in which you're almost having to ridicule yourself to an extent by saying that you know enough, but you don't know enough to already be there. Meaning that you can accept the change, which is sort of an accepting of ignorance, but you know enough to know the difference. So then all the difference is for your benefit. And I think that that's sort of the mechanism involved in a procedure which allows there to be more to things as an ending. And maybe then really the best way for you to create endings is for you to create beginnings. It's the idea that a blank sheet of paper holds value. After all, give a master a blank sheet of paper and he holds the entire world in his hands. And I think that this holds true to many things in a master's hands. But then again, looking back at this book here, we see that Kublai has something in his hands as well. What does it afford him? The great Khan owns an atlas in which are gathered the maps of all the cities, those whose walls rest on solid foundations, those which fell in ruins and were swallowed up by the sand, those that will exist one day and in whose place now only hares' holes gape. And he has this and they say this about his ability to have such a thing inside of his hands as somebody holding the world or spinning the globe in their hands. I think you recognize cities better on the atlas than when you visit them in person, the emperor says to Marco, snapping the volume shut. And Polo answers, traveling you realize that differences are lost. Each city takes to resembling all cities. Places exchange their form, order, distances. A shapeless dust cloud invades the continents. Your atlas preserves the differences intact, that assortment of qualities which are like the letters in a name. So perhaps what we retain if we try to be a master is the differences of all things. But then I think that the more of a master you are, maybe the less that things really can change or affect change. And we see that this kind of gets into this whole idea of what can happen in, combinatorics, mathematics, probabilities and things about what can happen. But in terms of, there being some out to sort of this field of chaos in which we're traversing now as the river, is that the more that you understand differences, the more you understand you're different, and that values themselves are completely subjective. Maybe even more so the more that you create something that is objective. Because if you create something so overwhelmingly objective as, let's say, a true ending, then maybe you've created something for everyone. Maybe basic statements are really the greatest way to handle such insurmountable things. which maybe is perhaps where the idea that less is more can come from in terms of an ending, and how we can then relate that to the idea of where we believe that there is no grand plan. Maybe things are all subjective, even more so that we begin to believe that it is all for us. Ironically enough, believing subjectivity believes in nobody else. But how does that change our focus? You see, there's almost quadratics for every type of statement. Because what does subjectivity prove in context in which it's most normally spoken of? Everybody or you? And I'm going to move on because I know that I've said the words correct, not wrong. So, when we say them, that less is more. Again, talking about there being chance involved once more. It seems as though we can say all the same things, but with different tones. It's just a very subtle, slight differentiation between something having a positive spin or a negative one. Oh, in what great detail must a thing show for us to know? For then it is up to our ability to create something, but for ourselves. As the master holds in their hands, maybe in his other hand, a blank sheet of paper as well. Because then again, we're thinking of subjectivity, but for ourselves, by creating it for ourselves, not for everything. Then maybe if less is the ending, can we cause our own ending? Do we have that much control to say that we are the ones who rings death's bell toll? What kind of courage does it take to cause one's own end? Especially if it's for purposes like this, not for others. Enemies and friends. Maybe then if I can take life into my own hands, then I can do every risky thing for these ends. then there is chance involved. But maybe I've created subjectivity again because the greater amounts of these things that I've done just because, the more that my life seems implausible. But you see, it has to have direction. Otherwise, it's unintelligible. See, life can be like a game where there is more to lose. But at the same point in time, it is less. Because all you need is to say what a thing needs. Say what's important at best. And at that point in time, maybe saying what's important draws you a straight line right to your nerves' endings. In a sort of way, it kills you to say what's important if you really could say ultimately what the most important thing was here today, or any day for that matter. Then you've made things personal and subjective. But in the way in which, if you knew your true directive, I think it would affect everything. And that's subjective objective.